You have failed me for the last time.
The sky is falling. It's a phrase usually used to mock someone who's gotten a little carried away with the dramatics. But sometimes, every once in a while, it really does drop out of the sky.
This loot crate system is exactly the type of system that you would find in a free-to-play game.
Well, the entire game appears to be leveraged towards people who are willing to spend quite a bit of money on top of the $60 you pay just to get into the game, obviously, when you buy it.
And the unthinkable has finally happened. A country is actually going to ban loot boxes in gaming.
With Star Wars Battlefront 2, it's pay to win! It's pay to win! That's right, it's pay to win!
Star Wars is a name that isn't new to being associated with all sorts of things of varying quality. This was absolutely awesome. This was so bad George Lucas literally tried to wipe it out of existence. It's a Star Wars Christmas special. This is really cool. This is confusing. Hard to believe they were a part of the same film. And games are no exception to Star Wars' somewhat eclectic mix of pitchfork and torches bad and groundbreaking good. It's really easy to focus exclusively on the mess that was the launch of Battlefront 2. It's even easier to write the game off solely on that nightmare. But we're coming on 2 years since the game released. The launch mess wasn't just a big deal to gamers, it set the dev team back 6 months in post-release development, as the game's design director has stated, forcing them to reorganize their content releases and putting them in a no-win situation. In 2019, Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a game that is now being controlled much more closely by its developer than the money-hungry EA. This is probably the way it should have been in the first place, especially given there is not one shred of evidence that proves that the executives at EA are not literally Sith Lords themselves. I mean, seriously, look at this guy. Today, Battlefront 2 is an afterthought. The sky fell and no one picked it back up. For everybody except for people like me, apparently. And I decided to put myself through what I expected to be a cruel joke for the past few weeks, and it turns out, well, I'm kinda glad I did. Today we're going to dive deep into Star Wars Battlefront 2, but I kinda wanted to do this one differently. I wanted to look at what it would be like if you were just getting Star Wars Battlefront 2 today for the first time, never having played it. Even though I've been playing the game off and on since launch. But what I want to do here is, I want to look at everything that's changed about Battlefront 2. Everything that's been manipulated, moved around, everything that's been fixed, everything that's made better, and I also want to look at everything that still doesn't work, everything that's still great, and every problem that the game still has. We're going to look at every aspect of Battlefront 2. We're going to start with the gameplay and move to progression, as well as the single player, which has changed as well. So to get started, I think it's best if we provide a little bit of context here.
That's how I generated over $50,000 a week out of my one-bedroom apartment. And in my Making Money package, I'll show you some secrets.
This is just as pleasant as beating the proverbial dead horse that is the loot box train wreck that was this game's launch. But it's actually important to talk about in this piece really quickly, simply for context. I've put some timestamps in the description, so if you're well versed on the numbers of the first 2 games, feel free to skip ahead to the gameplay section. Still here? Cool. Story time. 2015's Battlefront was EA's first attempt at a Star Wars game after striking a deal with Disney that would give EA the exclusive games licensing rights to the franchise. That means the only people allowed to make a Star Wars game was EA. What could go wrong? In the case of the first Battlefront, a lot, apparently. It was a $60 multiplayer-only game that strayed far too casual, lacked any significant content at launch, and laid its foundation in gimmicky token power-ups and its own self-indulgent beauty. So 2 was an attempt to course correct. According to DICE and EA, 3 studios would work together to create this experience. EA Motive on single player, DICE on multiplayer, and Criterion would handle space combat. It would add a single-player mode after this tweet made the rounds. It was supposed to be built to make the game a bit more competitive, it would have more content, essentially be the game the first should have been. And then the beta hit and people came to a, oh my god, Snape's actually the good guy sized revelation. Battlefront 2 was an unethical, offensive reach for your wallet. The game was riddled with loot boxes that included star cards that boosted your stats, and doing the math on that one like an SAT prep question, the answer is C, pay to win. and it was really pay to win. Not only could you buy statistical advantages over your opponents, but heroes themselves were priced so far out of reach in terms of their unlocks that it would take hours to get them on your own. Why? So you felt the need to spend your money on them, of course. Some game controversies come and go like every episode of My Life as a Teenage Robot, ready to be forgotten and forgiven. But this was not one of them. This moment changed gaming. The revolt against loot boxes and microtransactions kicked into high gear, and Battlefront 2 was the unwilling sacrifice, missing sales expectations by 1 million units within its launch window, and somehow it managed to damage EA's reputation more than anything they had done since twice being crowned worst company in America. So, Disney stepped in and EA stepped back. The second the game wasn't lucrative for them anymore, it seemed as though the actual people making the game regained control of their vision. And that vision has shifted and molded Star Wars Battlefront 2 into something new. So I sat back down to play, but it wasn't enough to just play it. I talked to members of the community, lengthy conversation with channels like Battlefront Updates to talk about the minutia of these changes, and that something new starts foundationally with a multiplayer experience.
Because they want a war to promote their product. They don't give a crap what kind of friendships it costs. You two want a war so bad? Then you fight.
We're going to break this down in a way that makes it most manageable. We'll start with the main game modes and work through everything the game has to offer on that end, and then in the middle of that, because it's required for continued context, we'll get to the most dramatic changes, and that's progression. Galactic Assault at launch was kind of like watching Target open their doors on Black Friday. 40 people blindly rushing in random directions, searching for literally anyone to get too close to their copy of Trolls on Blu-ray so they'd have an excuse to hit somebody. But today, it's where everything that makes Battlefront 2 special and frustrating rears its inexplicably confusing head. Hopping into a game of Galactic Assault is an unbelievable assault on the senses. No pun intended. Frostbite was built from the ground up around the FPS structure. That's what Frostbite, the game's engine, was built for. Part of the reason Mass Effect Andromeda failed on a technical level is because EA insisted BioWare Montreal shove a pseudo-open world numbers RPG into a Frostbite engine that simply was not prepared to meet the game's demands. Battlefront 2 is exactly the kind of game that shows off what this engine is capable of. It is one of the most beautiful FPSs you will ever get your hands on, and it makes every moment feel authentically Star Wars. Running around Kashyyyk with a blaster in your hand covered in mud is about as close as you'll get to being in a modern Star Wars movie up until now. I mean, seriously, just look at these character models. This is insane. On Ultra, on PC, these things look like they are directly out of one of the films. The sound design is also a continuation of this authenticity. I've never been playing a game of Call of Duty and thought, man, I really wish Touchin' on Your Mama 28X would shut up so I can hear the ambient sounds of Nuketown. But playing Battlefront 2 with headphones is a revelatory experience. The sound of blasters to your left, TIE fighters in the sky, and sabers clashing is as sweet as the swelling score of this mode that does an excellent job of using orchestral tracks that change and manipulate based on stages and momentum. Gordy Hobb is considered to be one of the very few people on George Lucas's scoring shortlist. He composed over 150 minutes of music for Battlefront 2. Hobb is known as an orchestral master, and he composed the music for this game to react horizontally, believing that was best for Star Wars. Horizontal musical interaction means that as the player interacts with a game or a match comes to a close, the music seamlessly changes in response. Vertical interaction would have the music layer and ramp up in intensity instead. Hobb knew that wouldn't work here. Hobb's score for Battlefront 2 shifts and molds itself each match so beautifully, you'll wonder why he isn't being nominated for a Grammy. And his compositions here are a consistent level of greatness you don't normally see in multiplayer shooters. Galactic Assault is the best mode to show these things off, the beauty of these giant maps, and Hobb's ever-shifting genius. But Battlefront 2 never took any heat for not being pretty enough or not being sonically adept. What Galactic Assault is, still today, is a microcosm of the game's realities. Too many people at launch judged the game through the context of a Call of Duty or Battlefield. Some wanted the next hyper-competitive shooter and missed what the game actually was and is. Galactic Assault is what many would consider the main draw or primary attraction of the game, and it is, intentionally so, a more casual affair than other esports shooters. Here, you'll go through stages, as the match moves into its own self-contained levels, as one team pushes forward and the other defends, either through escorting a payload that acts independent of player action, or by accomplishing a myriad of objectives. Its pace moves smartly by player-driven storytelling. On Camino, for example, the droid army is there to infiltrate and shut down the cloning facility. These aren't just maps to Battlefront 2, they're stories. It's a good time. Getting bored is never really an issue, thanks in part to the battle point system. At launch, the system kind of sucked. How much heroes cost was often dependent on their era or locale, and it often placed them out of reach price-wise for the ones that you really wanted to play if they weren't in era for that map. If you weren't an adept player, you might not have gotten your chance at the heroes you wanted to play. This was in the name of immersion, not in the name of fun. Today, the battle point system has much better balance, and it's actually kind of great. Rewind back to 2015 and look how the previous Battlefront handled their heroes and vehicles. Instead of running around making a mad dash for power-up tokens as the 2015 entry had you doing, which also sucked, broke objective-based game modes, and made a lot of people question how anybody came up with this idea, in Battlefront 2, you earn points by playing the objective, getting kills and assists, and just generally existing. And eventually, you earn enough points to spawn as a hero or a Wookiee warrior, and so on. This also goes for vehicles. The idea behind this system is to create a natural and rewarding flow to what can be a somewhat lengthy game mode. Not only do you constantly feel as though you're working towards something every match, but it also creates the building of a sort of crescendo. The foot soldiers decide the early game because your points are low. The mid game starts to introduce the premium assault classes, and the climax of the match is decided by Jedis and heroes all peppering the map as players finally have the points to spend, all pushing for a climactic victory. It feels like an organic progression that's supported by in-game queue lines that notify you when a hero has entered battle. But this system is also exactly where the more accessible realities of Battlefront 2 show themselves. Everything you do gets you points, including dying. A reward meant to make everyone feel like every life is bringing them closer to something, even if they accomplished nothing. The respawn timer is also incredibly short. You're back in the match in 5 seconds. Since launch, spawning has changed dramatically. They fixed the squad and respawn system in pretty big ways, now allowing you to respawn on any squad mate that's outside of combat, as opposed to just any random spawn point. A change made less for strategic reasons, and more to, again, get players back into the action as quickly as possible. The 5-second spawn timer, however, well, this is a little problematic, especially in Galactic Assault. It's really hard to feel like you're making a genuine contribution to the outcome of Galactic Assault. In Battlefield, you can become a one-squad force of nature that defines the tide of a match. Battlefront, on the other hand, doesn't offer that feeling, mostly because you can be upended by a hero in seconds out of sheer wrong place, wrong time, with essentially no way to save yourself. And with death being so meaningless individually, with only waiting out enough time to scratch an itch, even with the trooper number dwindling, and the game literally rewarding you for your death, you get the feeling that death is less of a punishment for a lack of skill, and more of a routine inconvenience. This is great for the casual slant of the game. Get people back in the action quicker, don't get them down on themselves for deaths, never let them feel like they aren't doing something awesome or they're not great at the game. But all of this is not going to scratch the competitive itch. There are people that wanted an even shorter spawn timer, but I think that would only make the game even more chaotic. This inherent push for accessibility does indeed cause some chaos, but it's calmed a bit by the very uncomplicated shooting mechanics. Aiming down sights, moving, nor hip firing dramatically affects accuracy, which helps make gunplay a bit easier to grasp for beginners. Pick up a controller and you're going to know how to play Battlefront 2, at least at its very base level. To counteract that, little touches certainly create a small skill curve here. Obviously, accuracy still reigns king, as does smart movement, especially with jetpack troopers. Reloading functions as a timer-based QTE, something not unique to Battlefront. Land in the blue and you instantly reload. Land in the yellow and you have a short period to fire your weapon without it heating at all. And land anywhere else and the gun jams until the timer's up, leaving you vulnerable. It's a nice touch to keep you engaged in all aspects of the gameplay. And learning how to lead sniper shots or how best to utilize a jetpack trooper takes time. I want to be clear, while you've probably heard this game requires no skill at all, that is not at all true. Sure, it is easier to get into than other shooters, and its skill ceiling is probably lower, but hop into a match without experience, or even with a lot of it, and you will see a skill disparity, especially with heroes. Again, it will take a bit of time to hit that ceiling, but the game wants to make sure you take that time. How? By keeping you immersed. Galactic Assault is all about stories, and in an effort to sustain immersion, the maps are very particular about their boundaries. Some often don't have hard boundaries at all that keep you from exiting the playing field. This is a gift and a curse. It's great for the aesthetic of the game, but flawed in its implementation, which is something we're going to come back to. And while this hasn't changed much since launch, the maps, which present other problems, have. The one thing I heard time and time again before even diving into the game again for this piece was tale after tale about the poor balancing act the maps tried to engage in at launch. And I was there for it. With a game like Call of Duty, maps are built around lanes. They're also designed to be circled. This is so spawns can shift as teams push forward and push back. With MOBAs like Overwatch, maps are often built as one big lane that you can push forward with a payload on and never look back. But games like Battlefield usually have wide open maps that give you a litany of options in how you navigate it in general, usually thanks to control point gameplay modes. Battlefront, on the other hand, tries to combine all of those design principles without sacrificing the Star Wars immersion in Galactic Assault, and at launch, it mostly didn't work. Like, at all. I'm talking about Michael Bay Transformers without the GOAT Shia LaBeouf level of not working. Here is the reality of most Galactic Assault maps. You open up in a wide open space with just a tiny bit of terrain elevation, and your options are as follows. Go out into the wide open waiting to be shot down in this direction, or this direction. It's absolute chaos, and it's all in the name of creating a dynamic multiplayer narrative. DICE wanted these maps to play like a story, like a battle you'd see in the film, so they created them with immersion in mind, but they forgot about creating a balanced map. So you start in these aforementioned wide open spaces that aren't exactly great for coherent squad play or strategy, and you're slowly, as my friend Justin put it, funneled into spammy choke lanes that are nightmarish to navigate. Naboo is a great example of this. You start in this open regal courtyard area as this payload pushes forward, and slowly work your way into one of just two hallways that you need to infiltrate or defend that create nightmarish traffic before pushing even further into a final control area that's literally a small circle that is a dead end. Why? Because DICE wanted you to feel like you were being backed into a corner, fighting for your life on Naboo, but it removes strategy entirely, and often puts one side in a no-win situation. Once momentum on certain maps starts pushing in one direction, it is a rolling ball of hurt that doesn't stop until the match lopsidedly ends. There's no blowing a 3-1 lead here. They sacrificed Star Wars maps that could be explored and conquered for maps that made players feel like pawns in a game they lacked control over. DICE realized that and course-corrected rather dramatically with their more recent DLCs. Geonosis, for example, is a DICE showing that they've at least listened to the actual nuance of their feedback. It's a map that's much less spammy, that allows you to flank, to choose your approach, to strategize. There are certainly wide open spaces, especially towards the end of a Galactic Assault match, but they're surrounded by lanes that are much more dynamic and difficult to choke. This was, of course, a free update. Geonosis shows that DICE understands the promise of better maps, and understands where they went wrong with the original maps, and that they're at least for the time being committed to fixing them. But I can certainly see how the Galactic Assault map problem in general is only a problem if you view Battlefront as a competitive experience. The map design proves exactly what the progression proves, an ongoing theme of this piece, which I'm about to get further into. DICE wanted to create a bit more casual of a shooter, one that everyone can enjoy regardless of skill level. Let me be abundantly clear, this does not make Battlefront 2 bad. In fact, it's part of what makes it such an easygoing power fantasy good time. But its casual nature is probably what dwindled its player count so quickly, and certainly isn't great for its longevity. But it needs to be said that this community, which not only still exists but is going strong, doesn't expect and never did expect an esport. And when you go into Battlefront 2 with that perspective in mind, understanding what it actually is, it's way easier to enjoy and appreciate for everything it does right. But there's also the elephant in the room. Galactic Assault is kind of the primer for everything that Battlefront 2 offers. It almost feels at times like the entire game was built around Galactic Assault mode. It's actually strange in that way, but when you remove the sheen of those giant 40-player leveled battles, you kind of see Star Wars Battlefront 2 for what it really is underneath all that.
What do you think? Huh?
No, this is not a gym. This is like a scene out of Saw 5.
You haven't even looked around yet.
Ah, here we are. The gaming controversy that would shake gaming to its core. The problem that really grinded the gears of gamers. A mistake big enough to make even Jar Jar Binks blush. Speaking of Jar Jar, after his introduction in The Phantom Menace, the backlash was swift with his character. People despised him. George Lucas, however, did not. So instead of removing the character from Episode 2, George, in his infinite wisdom and maturity, gave fans the ultimate middle finger. He not only kept Jar Jar, but put him on the Senate. There's a scene in Attack of the Clones where he breaks the fourth wall and smiles directly at the camera as if to say, "Hey, screw you guys, I'm still here." That's a bit like what EA did with loot boxes and progression in Battlefront 2, even after being slammed for this trend before the game's release. But instead of spending an hour recapping that nightmare, let's talk about how dramatically it's changed since, and in how too many ways it's still broken. There is absolutely no more pay-to-win mechanics, literally at all, in the game today. In fact, there aren't even earnable loot boxes outside of daily crates and cosmetic crates that you can buy that tell you exactly what's in them, and they're totally superfluous. For all intents and purposes, outside of those few cosmetics, there are no longer any microtransactions in the game at all, outside of character skins and emotes. And none of those are locked behind paywalls. They're all easy enough to earn just by playing the game. This removes the pay-to-win issue that the game saw at launch entirely, and it's great. But removing that pay-to-win system shows how foundationally flawed the underlying progression really is, and how truly built around loot boxes the game was. Instead of pay-to-win, it's now grind to win. In Battlefront 2, your main progression is built around these star cards, and in some ways this progression system is great. To level up your classes, you have to play those classes, as skill points are unique to that class, and even individual heroes. To upgrade your weapons and unlock new ones, you have to hit certain gameplay milestones. This all works well. But the star cards are a mess. They are, by themselves, balance breaking and decimate any semblance of fair competition. If you view the game through the lens of pick up and play, relaxing passive experiences, it's no big deal. But as of today, star cards reward those who play extensively and punish new or casual players, which is kind of antithetical to what the game seems to want to accomplish. It does make sense in the context of launch, however. They wanted casuals to pay to keep up, so they built a system to reward hardcore play and disadvantage others. You can equip 3 star cards at once. They are unlocked by leveling up and proceeding to use upgrade points to upgrade them to their max level. They dramatically change play. Some increase your health by as much as 20%, some increase grenade blast radius by the same amount, some proffer a massive boost in health regeneration, others limit certain types of damage taken. This is in a competitive multiplayer game. There's even a card that increases your battle point earn rate by 15%, making you much more likely to get to play as the heroes you choose than a newcomer. This affects every mode, including heroes and villains. These are not simple perk cards like in Call of Duty, these are significant player upgrades. That means that today, were you to hop into the game, you would have no choice but to play at a wild disadvantage for a large chunk of time, and continue to be punished until you've played enough of the game. The rich get richer, the more you play, the more skill you develop, and the bigger statistical advantage you have. Picture this. You're playing Overwatch, and your diva has base stats, but the diva on the opposing team has a damage boost, a better shield, and quicker mech recharge. Imagine how that might affect competitive balance. But we have to face facts. This was okay with DICE, EA, and Disney. They wanted to create a power fantasy. They want to create a toy box for the Force. They don't care whether or not it works functionally as an esport. And it makes sense. Star Wars is a property that reaches people of all walks of life, game players and non-game players. Disney and EA by extension believe strongly in creating an accessible experience. By the very nature of the inclusion of the balance-breaking heroes, they're all but spelling that out. It is admirable that Disney stepped on EA's throats like a sociopathic Mickey Mouse to get the pay-to-win mechanics removed, but it left behind a foundationally flawed progression system that is dramatically different than it was at launch on the surface, but still poisoned beneath it. But progression isn't the only dramatic change to the game. some of which are absolutely phenomenal. Do you remember this? Nature's greatest abomination. Cat Dog. This is exactly what it was like to play any match of heroes versus villains, or even come across two lightsaber wielders in any match at all. At launch, lightsaber duels were less amazing feats of cinematic glory and more annoying, tedious duels to the bored to death. Stamina would drain when you swung your saber or when you blocked an attack only, and thus people would just kind of stand there holding block, hoping to live out their opponent's patience. This also creates less nuance amongst the heroes, as the strategy always ended up being the same regardless of hero, mostly because there were not nearly enough differences between their stats to matter. But if you picked up the game today, well, you'd have a system that's idiosyncrasies allow for some truly special and enjoyable gameplay. For a while, stamina drained passively as you held your guard up, which worked, prevented spamming, but recently they overhauled the system once more, with guards not draining stamina, but instead, stamina draining with every attack actually blocked, and they also removed the ridiculous stagger an attacker would be hit with when striking a blocking opponent, instead making it so you can no longer attack when your stamina is drained. This ensures that tactical play stays relevant amongst lightsaber duelers. Guard forever and you might be tossed across the map or destroyed after your guard goes down. But overreach and lay into someone blocking for too long and you'll open yourself up to be decimated. This balancing act only works because now heroes, after an absurd amount of updates, have dramatically different stamina profiles. Darth Maul has no guard. He can't block attacks, he is true to his character. He plays as an acrobatic, quick-striking phantom. He had no stamina profile for a while until they recently buffed his attacks and made his attacks drain stamina only. And thus, playing as Maul is a test of sheer calculated aggression and timing, the way it should be. In contradiction, Vader is a hulking, slow-moving defensive hero with excellent blocking stamina and poor attack stamina. It individualizes your play, making each hero something you need to learn character by character. And developing an understanding of the best counters and strengths of each of them is finally crucial to your success. Instead of feeling like there's 2 or 3 classes, the assaulters like Maul, the tanks like Vader, and the balanced heroes like Luke or blasters like Finn create a true and interesting dichotomy. These changes made playing as heroes finally exactly what it should be. For a point of reference as to how much support this game is still receiving, these most recent stamina changes among heroes and villains, they came in an update in March of 2019, a year and a half after release. Now playing as Luke or Kylo Ren isn't a nauseating experience of button mashing or holding guard, it's finally the strategy-driven dueling you saw in the films. The small stamina changes making hero game modes finally worth engaging in. It's still a bit of a mess at times, but it's now way more enjoyable. This is back-ended by small gameplay nuances, and these modes that keep them interesting. Maps like Endor seem perfect for heroes versus villains, as there's nothing quite like force-throwing Anakin off a bridge as Darth Maul, even if it does become an annoyance for some harder core players.
It's funny that at times throughout Battlefront 2's life, heroes versus villains actually being a Jedi, actually wielding a lightsaber, being Boba Fett, all kind of felt like an afterthought in the context of this game. And so it's interesting now to see them really doubling down into creating what should have been there in the first place. The ability to feel like you're a lightsaber wielder. The duels that define the franchise. The choreographed, refined movements of what it would feel like to be a Jedi. It's finally starting to get there, even if heroes versus villains, like I said, isn't always the greatest thing.
But speaking of modes that didn't work at one point or another. Battlefront offered space dogfighting, the original 2015 release, and it was a mess. Not only was it a relatively simple affair, kind words for boring, it was also at times disorienting. Criterion, developer of the Burnout and Need for Speed franchises, was brought on to that game mid-development, simply to help how the speeder bikes worked on Endor. You heard that right, they brought the Burnout devs on board with all their expertise to fix some bikes. So when Battlefront 2 rolled around, they decided to give the team some real responsibility. EA brought them in to rebuild dogfighting and ship flying from what it was, which was essentially a slog, from the ground up. It shows. This is a team that understands how to design vehicle mechanics. Flying in almost any ship feels smooth as butter it's glorious. Getting in the Millennium Falcon feels weighty and moves with force, whereas the nimble TIE fighter dances through the air almost weightless. Making use of your ship's abilities, whether they be missiles or droid repairs, is a dance of strategy, as one false move will land you tumbling out of the sky. Where ground combat can often make you feel invincible, flying through the sky is a test of vulnerability. Skilled pilots make incredible use of the new flight system and maneuver through tight windows like it's nothing. But it's the almost deceitful simplicity that hooks you. Anyone can fly in Battlefront 2. The basic ship controls are easy to grasp, and most importantly, fun. But like any good gameplay system, mastering it is where you'll see a true skill curve. Easy to pick up, hard to grasp. It isn't nearly as intense as one you'd see flying in Battlefield, but one that certainly separates the Chippendale Rescue Rangers from the Poe Damerons. We give you just enough rope to hang yourself with, a Criterion dev once told Forbes when it comes to speed in dogfighting. They manage to make you feel in control even when allowing you to move your ship at impossible speeds, as they put it, and that's a true accomplishment. For once, both casual and skilled players will actually look forward to utilizing air combat in a multiplayer game, and I'm not sure that's accomplished anywhere else in modern gaming. Having a circular reticle that leads your target, showing exactly where you need to shoot to land a hit, certainly requires less skill, but does an excellent job of giving the player a mechanical understanding of how shots land and how they react to distance, preparing them quickly for the significantly harsher environments of online dogfights than the ones they're getting in single player. It is again, however, worth pointing out that being literally shown where to fire does indeed skew to the more casual side of the game, and does make star cards more influential, as the playing field evens out more from a skill perspective at higher levels. It's worth pointing out that in my opinion, star cards aren't as damaging here as they are elsewhere, even if they won't as a result be everyone's cup of tea, and I know that people have problems with them in dogfights. And those online dogfights are serviced by more than enough modes to satisfy those looking for them. But as we wrap up multiplayer, I think it's worth getting back onto the ground to see where you'll find a bit more skillful play. It's Strikes and Blast where you'll really see some of the nuance and skill that is possible in Battlefront 2. These are the smaller, more blaster-based modes that play more like traditional FPSs. Here it's where little touches come into play a bit more obviously. The Assault class, for example, has a skill called Vanguard. Using it whips out a shotgun and allows for a bit of strategy. See, when Vanguard is equipped, you can better handle CQC situations, but Vanguard also boosts your run speed a bit, which makes it great for flanking and outmaneuvering your opponents. However, skilled players know if they let the skill run all the way out, they'll be greeted with a 2-second animation that is visually pleasing as smoke pours out of the gun, but makes you a sitting duck. So you have to pay attention and cut the skill out right before it expires, so you save yourself the headache. These little touches are great and differentiate the classes, but they've always been there, and it strikes where you're going to see these techniques used most often, where you're going to find the most level of playing fields, and where you'll likely be tested. This applies across the board from smaller game modes, including things like Blast. But it's the game modes that DICE added that really changed the feel of the game post-launch, in terms of it being a complete package. I'm particularly fond of the Cabin in the Woods simulator Ewok Hunt. Added not too long ago, this is a wholly unique Star Wars experience you will not get anywhere else, maybe ever. Here you're left in the middle of the forest in pitch black night on Endor. You're with 20 stormtroopers at your side, and your only goal is to survive the night until extraction. It's a weird pseudo-horror experience. You only have your gun and your flashlight, which works on a timer and will run out and require recharge. The Ewoks have traps set throughout the forest. They are fast and they will kill you in seconds. Hearing their cries in the darkness is hilarious and terrifying, and you're forced to stick together to survive. If you die, you become an Ewok yourself. Fast-moving, nimble, the hunter. With the ability to cry out to your other Ewoks, it is tense, it is hilarious, it is awesome. This is the creativity I've always wanted to see out of Battlefront for 4 years. This is interesting, even if it's a bit ridiculous. Since launch, the game has gotten a litany of new modes, Hero Showdown, a round-based 2v2 hero mode, amongst others. But it's also received multiple new maps, and importantly, it did what the original game refused to do after launch. DICE pulled from every corner of the current Star Wars universe. It brought in villains like General Grievous, dipping deeper into the Clone Wars. It brought in skins from Solo, including this one, which I love. It takes content from The Last Jedi, an entire season of it. In fact, it no longer concerns itself with arbitrary universe restrictions, and instead focuses on creating the Star Wars sandbox everyone wanted in the first place. Let's conclude this multiplayer portion. Here's the reality in its totality when it comes to the base multiplayer experience of Battlefront 2 as of today. in 2019 before we get to the single player and even what's changed there. While the glossy sheen on the outside of the game has changed, its controversy all but buried, it is now just a better version of what it always set out to be. It is a very different game in the case of heroes and squads mechanically, and in the case of progression in really big ways, but what I think it is more than anything is just a much better multiplayer experience. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it's certainly worth spending time with. It is the Star Wars Battlefront 2 that should have released at launch. As long as you can accept it isn't built to be a hyper-competitive or even tightly balanced game, you'll have a great Star Wars time. But multiplayer isn't the only thing worth analyzing here. The single player is still here and there's even more of it now. But is it any good?
The single player is its own beast in its entirety. It's a strange piece of the game that felt like it only existed at launch because everybody asked for it and John Boyega sent out that infamous tweet about wanting single player. And so EA kind of put it in there or put it on DICE to say, hey, get this in there for marketing reasons or sales reasons, put it on the box, we have single player. And yet, what it was at launch, it still kind of is today. Bugs and cases have been worked out, but now there's 20% more of it. So in a way, it's kind of drastically changed from what it was in its initial state, even if what it is now is a bit foundationally like it always has been. Let me explain that.
House is afraid of it.
Rat poison?
A booby
Is awesome.
You don't want to get caught in one?
Small claim score?
No!
Single player. We're going to look at this portion of the game in pieces. The campaign's gameplay, its story, and then its expansion. Battlefront 2 as a single player experience feels a lot like repeating this line
You left me no choice, brother.
over and over again. Your options are limited. You're left with very little choice other than the campaign. After the backlash hit in waves against the lack of a true single-player campaign in 2015's release, DICE and EA assured players that single-player fans will be happy come the release of its sequel. Let's talk about the substantial stuff here first, and leave the least important single-player offerings, arcade, for last. And trust me, it is far and beyond the least important element of this entire package. Replaying the campaign for this piece left me pleasantly surprised from a sheer gameplay perspective. This is not the extended tutorial that a lot of other multiplayer-focused games force onto players to prepare them for their time online. Sure, it teaches you a thing or two, but instead, DICE created what I'm going to refer to as a light side greatest hits collection. And by DICE, I mean EA Motive. In terms of gameplay, this is a fairly enjoyable trip through the Star Wars universe. Let's get some background out of the way first. The game's writers have gone on record multiple times to explain how this story came together. The main protagonist here is Iden Versio. She's the daughter of an Imperial Admiral. She is supposedly the bad guy, the commander of a Special Forces Imperial hit squad known as Inferno Squad. As the tie-in novel notes, Inferno Squad was formed by the Empire after the Rebels stole the original plan for the Death Star with the goal of wiping out the quote-unquote Dreamers, as the novel puts it. But the game's writers had a problem. They had to stay within canon, and the game was set to come out before the release of The Last Jedi. So, they were boxed into a corner. They had no choice but to have Iden defect from the Empire and become a rebel, because they couldn't reveal any of the origins of the First Order. The game was meant to bridge the gap between episodes 6 and 7. Keeping Iden as an Imperial would have forced them to steal the film's reveals, so the cliche redemption story was left at their feet. Part of the problem with the story and campaign, as I'll talk about, is the cliche nature of Iden's redemption, given how much EA marketed the campaign as a story of an Imperial loyalist. You were going to get to be the bad guy, embody the Empire. Except, surprise, not really, but let's focus on gameplay first. The campaign starts with you, Iden, being held captive on a rebel ship in an attempt to gain intel. Here you're introduced to your droid, ID-10 or Dio, who will play next to no role in gameplay outside of this mission, other than being a key you interact with, and a weaponized tool that gives you the ability to shock your enemies once he's charged, stunning and often killing them, making him a reasonably interesting and ever-present combat mechanic. But after an annoying series of vents you're meant to fly through, you finally take control of Iden, whom you meant to stealth your way through the halls with. Except, stealth in Battlefront 2 never really works. Unless an enemy is directly in front of you in a linear path, somehow the AI almost always detects your presence, even when crouched behind them. This makes stealth an almost obsolete tool throughout most of the game. The good news is the devs seemed aware of this, as there isn't a single bit of the game where it's required for your progress. Every encounter can be handled blasters blazing. From there, you make your way onto Endor, and this is where the campaign's greatest gift starts to reveal itself. These levels or worlds are beautifully realized, and unlike in multiplayer, the campaign gives you the opportunity to truly take them in, exist within them at your pace. Look around. Endor is gorgeous, for example, the Force meticulously detailed, and watching the Death Star implode in the sky above you is one of the coolest things I've ever seen in a Star Wars game. But Iden, however, once you control her, is never anything other than a foot soldier. It's your typical FPS fare when you're in control of her on the ground. She develops a reasonable loadout throughout the course of the game, and her abilities like her shield and vanguard are useful, but you'll spend most of the game simply taking out bad guys with blasters of various kinds, which is essentially what you're going to get on Endor. It's a breezy walk with very little resistance, an unfortunate trend for the campaign. This game is not hard. Even on higher difficulties, it's not challenging in any way that's well designed. The dev team took the jokes about stormtroopers never hitting their mark a little bit too seriously here. Enemy AI almost never misses, but are also entirely unintelligent, rarely use cover well, and almost never are anything more than fodder, which the game attempts to make up for by throwing a cacophonous amount of enemies at you at once, but it doesn't solve the problem, so the game's forced to turn to variety. Almost every mission either starts and ends with you ending up in the sky, so if you hate flying, well, this is going to be a struggle. The good news is, almost every one of these sequences is well designed and enjoyable. Dogfighting here is just as great as it is in multiplayer, but here you'll be taking down all manner of aircrafts, transport ships, TIE fighters, unique boss ships, and you'll even have the chance to fly more recognizable ships like the Millennium Falcon. These missions aren't particularly complex, they boil down to shoot this, fly here, at least in the original main campaign, but they're enjoyable and don't take away from the pacing enough to be noteworthy in any way that isn't a positive. But it's when you leave Endor that things actually start to get fun again, even if they're never particularly challenging, as already mentioned. Pilio gives the Frostbite engine a chance to again blow you away. On Pilio, you'll take control of Luke as you run rampant through a field of stormtroopers. It's actually nice to have an environment like this that's designed for you to decimate everything in your path using the Force. It's a joyful release, even if it controls no differently than in multiplayer. The problem is, as much fun as this can be, the main focus of the Pilio mission is a defense section, where you have to defend Del, your pseudo-partner for this portion of the game, from a swarm of bugs while he lowers some defenses. It's annoying. The bugs come, you kill them, and you wait, hoping they don't hit Del until he finally finishes up over and over. This Defend X gameplay loop reoccurs throughout the campaign. It's never enjoyable, it's never interesting, and it's always boring, if not frustrating. The problem is they aren't creative in the way they approach these sections. It always comes down to kill an arbitrary amount of time as things shoot at you, Monster Closet style. And this is kind of the modus operandi of Battlefront 2's main, at-launch, campaign. Super highs and almost absurd lows. Take the Lando mission, for example. The Sullust exterior that opens this mission is so gorgeous that I literally just sat at the start of the mission for minutes, staring at it. Playing as Lando throughout the mission was equally as enjoyable. Using his smoke grenade in combination with his thermal sensor made me feel as though I was playing a super well-made licensed Predator game. It made combat throughout the mission exciting, and it felt like I was controlling the bedlam unfolding around me. But then, they stick Lando in a walker and put turrets and stormtroopers all around you and task you with walking up this hill? Instead of feeling powerful and weaponized, you suddenly feel like a plastic bottle waiting to be shot down. It's awful, and destroys the pacing of the mission. There's a mission on Naboo, where you control Leia. At the tail end of the mission, you're tasked with taking out Imperial soldiers as you slowly retreat to the palace. It is a tense showdown that makes you feel as though you're a part of a battle you are just on the cusp of losing. But to get there, you spend 20 minutes putting up your shield and sitting through countless defense sequences. Highs and lows. About the only exception to this rule in the main campaign is Han Solo's mission. Han's mission starts off by having you explore Maz's bar on Takodana. You walk around the busy castle filled with music, people talking, gathering intel, which is admittedly as simple as talking to 3 people, before finding your man. From there, you leave the castle and use Han to run through some Imperials on your way to the Millennium Falcon. There's no nonsense, it's good level design, it's fun. It, to its credit, doesn't make you want to skip parts of it. There are some really cool set pieces throughout the campaign as well, getting to control AT-ATs and STs, walking on the outside of a Star Destroyer as it burns to the ground, hitting the desert and going from air to ground combat back to air, moment to moment as you take down walkers with airstrikes, but none of it is groundbreaking and all of it has its design drawbacks. In totality, the main original campaign plays like a fun, flawed, and forgettable gameplay experience. Its story is why people most likely played it. Narratively, there's quite a bit going on here, and it's impossible to talk about without A, spoiling it, and B, talking about how the campaign shifted after launch. Iden Versio is a fine character. She's inoffensive, but she's simple. Here's what we know about Iden. Her father's an Imperial Admiral, she's never known anything but the Empire, and she's an extremely talented soldier. That's it. That's about as much insight into Iden's personality as we ever see. When the game starts, Iden is happy as an Imperial. There's an excellent scene, her and Del, who we'll get to, with a smile and a bit of excitement put on their helmets and get to work. Remember this scene. It actually comes back to one of the things the story does well. It really kicks into gear when Del, a fellow member of Inferno Squad and friend of Iden, is saved by Luke on Pilio. He makes this comment.
I've heard 100 stories about the Jedi. They terrified me as a boy on Coruscant, but you...
Which leads to this comment.
You're telling me the man who destroyed the Jedi Order was secretly one of them?
No. I'm telling you that as a boy on Coruscant, you were frightened of the wrong thing.
It's actually pretty good dialogue writing, but it's the beginning of the two's very cliche shift to the light side. Iden, Del, and fellow Inferno Squad member Hask are sent to their home planet of Vardos, which the Empire plans on decimating in a show of force. They think they're going to save everybody, at least the civilians, but they realize they're there to save just one life, as the Empire begins to destroy all other life on the planet. Iden and Del predictably attempt to stop this, as Hask, loyal to the Empire, attempts to keep them in line, informing them that helping civilians and leaving the planet would be treason. Iden and Del do it anyway. There's one scene in particular, right before all of this occurs, where the same stepping off the ship, putting on the helmet moment happens, but Iden and Del look uneasy, unsure, saddened by what they're about to do. It is subtle storytelling, scene for scene, at its best, and one of the highlights of the campaign.
And that's it for their turn to the light side.
The story checks only the most necessary of boxes. Emotional reason for change of heart? Check. Introduction to heinous act that leads to self-realization? Check. Opportunity to make the change? Check. There really is no more character development in either Iden or Del beyond that, other than their telegraphed romance. From there, their path to redemption becomes more of a show-and-tell story than it does anything else. See, Battlefront 2 is meant to show what happens in the direct aftermath of the second Death Star's explosion, as the Empire falls over the course of the next 30 years. You see the Empire struggle with direction. After the death of the Emperor, you see them seek vengeance as opposed to calculation. If this was what the story focused on, it would have been great, but again, we were robbed of that opportunity simply because Disney wanted the game and The Last Jedi to cross-promote each other. The problem with the story isn't that it's poorly acted, it's not. It's not that it's poorly paced, it's that it lacks any sort of focus or intrigue. The story can't tell us how the First Order was formed, it isn't allowed to reveal any crucial world details, only revealing why Luke was on Ahch-To for so long. He was called to the Empire's vault by the Force to find the compass, and the story never attempts to attach you to its narrative. It bounces from recognizable face to recognizable face, showing you Leia, Maz, Han, Lando, everyone it can. It allows you to participate in big moments like the destruction of the second Death Star and the Battle of Jakku to please the fans, and forgets to focus on the story it wants and needs to tell and the characters it should be developing. There are times when it feels like the game is actually attempting to break the fourth wall to wink at you. On Takodana during Han's mission, you're followed by an informant who incessantly provides weird Star Wars facts the entire time. He even fanboys out over seeing the Falcon.
You know the Falcon?
On average, I'd say 2.2 of every 300 Imperials knows the Millennium Falcon.
And at one point, Chewbacca laughs? It's almost like the writers knew all they were doing was trying to please one group of people, and so they decided to do just that. In fact, the climax of Iden finally finding her father hits with such a whimper, you actually forget this was her driving force all along. You remember this weird Chewbacca Han mission more than the story's climax. Its final ending is even a bit weirder. Decades later, a strange sequence that shows Kylo going into the mind of Del, who is alone, and extracting information before leaving him to be killed by Hask, who you supposedly had already killed, but surprise, he's alive. The sequence is very surreal and dreamlike and attempts to show you what happens when Kylo invades people's minds, but it's nothing more intriguing than a journey back to already visited locales. There is also no way for the main campaign to end other than Hask killing Del, which he does. Why? Because it has to explain why Del is conspicuously absent in the films and novels moving forward. They had to kill Del, which means almost all character development that wasn't there to begin with was for naught. It was a narrative that ended on a cliffhanger of sorts, and was one people did want to see wrapped up, so months after the game's release and The Last Jedi's, Resurrection would drop, promising to tighten up the loose ends of the story and give up some new characters. Its gameplay is actually a bit more varied. Your first space battle is the best one in the entire game, tasking you with taking out carrier ships and then defeating a boss that tosses EMP grenades your way. It's a unique dogfight and the highlight of the 2-hour-long DLC. From there, you, as old Iden Versio, are on the hunt for Del with your daughter Zay. You'll spend the short campaign running around in walkers, looking for Zay after she's been shot down by Hask, while swapping between foot combat and vehicle combat, before once again finding yourself engaged in the most annoying defense mission yet. But that Hask moment I just mentioned shows the potential of this narrative that was never brought to fruition. In Resurrection, Hask captures old Iden back on Vardos, and he forces you to watch as he shoots your daughter out of the sky. But there's a moment where he actually steps forward a bit, in front of Iden just so he can see her face as the shots are fired. It's cruel, it's subtle, it's, again, the tone and narrative precision the entire story should have had. But it doesn't. Iden and Del's daughter is just coming of age, the two having gotten out of the soldier life after the war and starting a family. Del's disappearance and death brought Iden back in, and her daughter as well. At this point, obviously, the First Order has begun to take over the galaxy, and Iden and Zay are tasked with bringing down Hask and his ship by Princess Leia. There is absolutely, once again, no character development to be found from any party involved. And that quick summary I just gave you is the extent of the narrative. But of course, by tying up loose ends, it's meant doing the only plausible thing and killing Iden Versio with a shot to the stomach after she finally takes down Hask, who is now a commander in the First Order. Why? Because again, this had to resolve the loose ends they had created. I want to point out for the most part, this makes the entire narrative essentially purposeless to the larger Star Wars narrative. But that's the issue EA and DICE have. That's really their only option. While the narrative itself could have, and probably should have been tighter, focused, and far more confident in the characters it was creating, the complaints that it doesn't matter to the Star Wars universe at large are kind of misguided. I'm not sure that was even ever an option. The single player is what everyone expected it to be. Fun, not consequential. It's not important, it isn't impactful, it's just a short, sweet story about a woman you don't care about that acts as the vehicle for you to blow stuff up as Lando and grab a drink as Han with Maz. Outside of this campaign, the only real single player offering other than botted modes is Arcade. And we're gonna make this short and sweet. Arcade mode makes a return, and it is 2 hours of boring missions that task you with slaughtering hundreds of AI that are already dumb as rocks to begin with. It's fun to play for about 10 minutes to get that power fantasy feel, but after those 10 minutes, it becomes almost insufferable. For the purpose of this piece, I'm actually just going to leave the discussion of Arcade at that. In 2019, Battlefront 2 is a significantly better game than it was at launch. It's actually quite good. Sure, its story, even after its expansion, isn't great. Arcade mode is still awful, but the reason you buy this game, the multiplayer, is almost in the state that it always should have been in. I have played the game off and on since its launch a year and a half ago. I've hated the game, I've been bored with it, but as of today, I'm actually quite in love with it. It is amazing what time and perspective can do for a game. It took a long time for me to come to terms with what Battlefront 2 is. What DICE's vision for an accessible shooter was, how much different in its idiosyncratic ways Battlefront 2 was designed to be amongst the sea of its hyper-competitive brethren. But when you pick up Battlefront 2, and do so solely with the hopes of being transported into the Star Wars universe with your friends, when you give in to its more casual approach to the shooter environment, when you take the time to learn how its heroes now work, it's something kind of special. This is a massive credit to DICE, who I want to personally applaud. They were given a no-win situation with EA's influence. They were saddled with a star card and monetization system that to this day still haunts the progression system in this game, but they've turned lemons into lemonade. They've been openly communicative. They are active on forums. They have done an excellent job over the past year of working from behind to fix something that was broken. They are not only talented, but they genuinely care. Say what you want about EA, but the Star Wars team at DICE is passionate about the game. They are, still, to this day, turning this game into something greater than it's ever been. There are teams, publishers, that give up on products when the dollar signs start to fade. There are teams that would have left this game behind 6 months after the launch debacle, but almost a year and a half later, and here's Star Wars Battlefront 2, still going strong. It's flawed, but man, I can't wait to keep playing. So to paraphrase the words of the great Luke Skywalker, I think I'd like some more Battlefront 2, please.
Well guys, that is it for today's video, and as always, start of a dialogue. What do you think of Star Wars Battlefront 2? Have you been playing it this whole time? Have you been playing it off and on? Did you give up on it? Were you never interested in the first place? And I think that intrigues me the most. The question I have is, what could EA and DICE do to get you to spend $60 on a Star Wars Battlefront 3? What would need to change? What would need to be included? What would they have to do to make this game something you want to play at launch? Let me know the answers to any of those questions down in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you are not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button. I put out gaming analysis and examinations as often as I can, so hit subscribe so you don't miss any of those. Really quickly, for those that are interested, yes, Force Unleashed 2 is coming. It'll be pretty soon. For those of you that don't know or just hop into this video, I do a full analysis on Star Wars Force Unleashed, one of the weirdest and most underrated games in Star Wars extended canon. I'm going to do 2 coming soon. That's what this update was. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be along the same lines as 1 in terms of the video format. So yeah, there's that. And as always, if you didn't know this video, I'm sorry. I put up more and more each and every week. Maybe you'll catch one of those. Maybe you'll enjoy that. But if not, thank you for giving me and this channel a shot. And until next time, guys, I'm out.